Quiet on the set. Here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody. I'm Dear Myrtle, your friend in genealogy. Welcome to the Albion Seed Study Group. We are up to the fourth and final migration pattern that has been considered in this rather hefty book by David Hackett Fischer, Albion Seed for British Folkways to America. We could spend a month on each of the folkways. And as in the past, I wanted to explain what the word folkways means. Now, we had two professors being discussed. One of them was the author, David Hackett Fischer, who has his own opinion. He cites William Graham Sumner about folkways being the study of the manners, customs, mores, and morals of people in a given place at a given time that are distinct and unusual for that migration group. With me on the panel today is my cousin Russ, Melissa Barker, the archive lady, and my other cousin, sounds like my other brother Daryl, doesn't it? My other cousin, Dave Robeson. So the concept that folkways are highly persistent but never static sounds like a contradiction in terms. It means that over a great deal of time things could change, but it's what did your grandmother do, your great-grandmother, it kind of got passed down through the family. And we've seen that in the 3 record groups or migration groups that we've looked at. So these with the star next to it are the main things that I looked for in each chapter to find what's distinguishing between these 4 migration groups. And in each chapter, I've limited myself. There are some good illustrations. Our chapter for Borderlands starts on page 605 if you want to turn there. I have given myself permission to copy some maps that show exactly where in Anglia for British Folkways, so that would also include Ireland. These folks tended to come. So our first migration pattern was right up Dave Robeson's alley, East Anglia to Massachusetts, very early 1629 to 41. We then talked about those distressed cavaliers and somewhat about their indentured servants coming in the 1642 to 75 time period. And in this particular slide, I'm still showing you 2 interesting books compiled by Peter Coldham to help you with research in that migration group. Last time we met, which seems like forever ago because of Roots Tech and the flu and everything else, we talked about the Friends migration. Came from 1675 to 1725 in the group that we were discussing. And this cousin Russ and I could relate to because we have early Welsh Quakers that bought property from William Penn and came in that time period. So tonight we're going to discuss the Borderlands to the backcountry, a flight from North Britain. Flight implies something there. It doesn't sound like it was a leisurely stroll. There are some push factors. And one of the words that keeps coming up in this chapter is the word fear. There's a lot of strife and fear, religious strife, political strife. I was shocked to know that in the 1733 to 73 time period, they think about 400,000 people from Ireland, mainly from Ulster, came. And I'm looking at a table on page 609 in Professor Fisher's book. But that table also explains that there were half that amount just from general places in Ireland. There were such things as Scotch Irish and Ulster Scots. Now, did anybody on the panel or in our group have people? Oh, Peggy's saying my people. Peggy, do you want to come up on the panel and you can help me pronounce some of these words? You're most welcome to raise your hand. I know you know how to do video and audio, and I'm so proud of you. You just had surgery. She just gave this webinar on Saturday. So your insights would be very useful. You're writing directly to the panelists. Do raise your hand and Cousin Russ will bring you up.
Peggy showed up on my We're Related software this morning. Believe it or not. And I also have Scots Irish from Ulster, Londonderry County, or County Londonderry.
Yes.
Direct ancestors.
Okay. So, Ms. Peggy, thank you for joining us. Do you want to unmute your mic and it's a button in the lower left called mute. And if you click it, it will unmute. So one of the things to consider about this migration group, oh, we can hear you. All right. And you keep tabs on me, you guys that have actual ancestors from this migration group. These people didn't come here for religious freedom. They were not trying to recreate their wealthy homeland plantations or large estates like our Cavaliers were. They weren't looking for a peaceable, well, I think they might have been looking for a peaceable place, but it just wasn't necessarily in their blood. They had been spending decades and decades of strife, with political strife and religious strife along certain areas. Now I'm going to show you the map in a minute, but remember, these are our 4 migration groups. And so it's this backcountry group. Now that's quite a bit later, almost like 100 years later than the Puritans. But I digress. The thing that I would recommend you do when looking at this book or looking at your ancestors and their characteristics, we're hearing some clicking. So till you get settled, Miss Peg, you might want to mute up again.
I'm all over the place, so right. I'm settled now.
Okay, dear. No worries. We're happy to have you. And you always contribute so much to our Hangouts when you're here. Actually, it's a webinar now, but I digress. When you consider different clothing styles, food customs, like my German grandmother, not one of these 4 migrations, you always had to have 7 sweets and 7 sours on the dining room table for a big family dinner. And so that involved pickling and things like that. Housing, we're going to be showing comparisons tonight. Child rearing, we can certainly discuss. And I did my little sketchy-poo thing that I do of how a community was formed physically. What was the layout? It's quite unlike Dave Robeson's more New England ancestors. All right, so here's one of the 2 maps that I've taken the liberty of copying from David Hackett Fischer's book. And so the shady areas are where these people came from. So before we were looking at completely different parts of England, but now we're into Scotland, the border area between, I think I have a little highlighting pen, not annotation. We got a spotlight pen, so theoretically, so that we can, there we go. So this little borderland between England and Scotland. And then of course we have our Irish folks. Now, in fact, one of the things that I read in this chapter was that people were so desperate. This is on page 632, next to last paragraph. In Ireland, so desperate did people become, and this was because of all the troubles, the social transformations, the pressure of one group over another, that these folks, there were some folks who attempted to escape in open boats across this Irish Sea, which was so rough that they drowned. Very treacherous. Wow, that's hard to imagine. The Irish Sea's the big part, not this little North Channel. They just had to get out of that place. most of these people were farmers or laborers, but they definitely were not landowners. This is very different from our Cavaliers, whose families were great landowners, but the son in question wasn't going to be inheriting that property. So these folks were living very simplistically back in the old country, and I think you'll see some of the things that some of their folkways, that they live very simply in the new country. All right, let's talk about the new country. And Dave, tell me where your people tended to settle. Now, at this time period, right now, this part of Pennsylvania doesn't look like the backwoods, but at the time it was the back country. Where are your people from, Dave?
Well, I know my fourth great grandfather, I have it documented that he was born in Virginia, but whether that was West Virginia, which it wasn't West Virginia until after the Civil War, but
yeah,
it could have been that Pennsylvania-Virginia line, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I haven't been able to get anywhere with my fifth great grandfather, who is allegedly Jonathan, who was allegedly born in 1740. Now, he may have gone to Londonderry, New Hampshire, and wandered down into that area, perhaps was a Revolutionary War soldier. This is all speculation on my part. And if he was a Revolutionary War soldier, he may have gotten a land grant in that area. I
you
just
don't know yet.
Nail it down. I mean, Robertson as a name and Jonathan, I mean, there's got to be 50,000 of those folks. So it's just tough. But
so
I do have.
So
and then from there down into Tennessee and Alabama.
Tennessee and then Alabama. And correct. I have folks that went into Kentucky. They went through the Gap and into Kentucky. But when you're looking at this whole central part of Massachusetts, we don't think of that as the back country. But in this time period, it was. Because it was far away from the rivers and things that were between that and New York or the coastal area. Russ, do you have anybody in the backcountry area?
Actually, one of the Worthington lines that I have researched came into West Jersey, which is just about where you're, it's down a little bit further. But then went down and got into the backcountry because there's a conversation that took place between George Washington and his brothers and the Worthingtons that lived in Charlestown, Virginia, now West Virginia.
Now West Virginia over here.
And they followed that gray area on that map up to the central part of Pennsylvania, which is, they went into Westmoreland County, which is about the center across the state. And then they ended up by going into Ohio, and the third governor of the state of Ohio is a Worthington that followed that route. Now, what was interesting...
You just never know about people, do you?
But what was interesting is at Roots Tech, a cousin came up to me and gave me the name of a person, which is the name I had seen before but didn't know where. But as soon as he said where he arrived, I knew that he was in this path that that came up that gray part of the backcountry, as you call it. But they followed. I didn't know why there was a migration, but I'm learning now. But now I know why the migration path and why they left West Jersey. They went straight down to Charlestown, and I've driven that road, so I know that it's not a bad road to travel way back before roads were there.
Was that could have been like I wish we had a map of all the old roads, like the Great Wagon Road and things like that. I don't have it on this slide.
Right.
All right, let's ask Miss Peggy.
I'm here.
Yeah. So where are your people from? Because you're saying these are your people.
Oh my gosh. Every single one of my lines is Scots-Irish and some German that all came in to the port of Philadelphia. And then they would have gone over to about the Lancaster area of Pennsylvania, and then gone a little bit southwest around the area. And then they would have gone southward down the Great Valley Road, starting at Winchester is the very tip of the Great Valley Road.
Yes.
And they would have headed on down, and it ends over in Tennessee, or around in that area. But it also breaks off and goes clear down into the Carolinas. Now, at that time that my people were traveling, all of the land along the eastern portion of Maryland and Virginia, North and South Carolina, that was already taken up by the English for their tobacco farms. So all of that good land was already taken. So the Germans that were also coming down the Great Valley Road, they tended to go on the east side of the Shenandoah Valley because they got along fairly well with the English. And the Quakers that were migrating down to North and South Carolina also were on good terms with the English and the Germans. So if you have people that were referred to as friendly Germans, they got along well with the Quakers. They may have believed the same Quakers, but they didn't convert. Now, on the west side of the Shenandoah Valley, that was the closest to the frontier, and that's where the Scots-Irish came down. Because they didn't get along with the Germans or the Quakers. They certainly didn't get along with the English, and the other people on that west side would have been the Native Americans. So, you know, they don't care about who they fight. They've been fighting people with mail and armor for thousands of years, so that sure, they'll fight you.
Absolutely. So that's an interesting thing, because I do have Hans Jost Hyde as a direct ancestor who was part of that development of the eastern side of the Shenandoah Valley. And those big plantation owners loved having the Germans and the Scotch-Irish and the Quakers as that buffer between their wonderful plantations and those wild Indians out west. So
well, and it's also important to remember that the term it's actually Scots-Irish, SCOTS, because Scotch is a drink.
Yes, I said it. Yeah.
That term was never known in Scotland or Ireland. They were first of all called the Irish when they got here, and then as the Irish potato famine in the 1840s developed, then they began to call themselves Scots-Irish to kind of define themselves between the two groups. So that's a term that's unheard of in the British Isles.
And so that distinction of the old Irish or Scot people, borderland people, from the immigrants that came 100 years later.
Yeah, and at the time that they were developing into the Scots-Irish, at that time, that was during the plantation of King James.
Oh, yes.
Where it's not a noun, it's a verb. It's where you're actually planting people from one place to another. At around the same time, there was also the plantation of Virginia around Jamestown going on. So he had a lot going on all these fronts. The very same King James that was having his 54 scholars translate the Holy Bible. So he's got a lot going on at the same time period.
It really, this was a tremendous time. All right, I want to talk about haulers. In each of the previous sessions, I've spent my time drawing a map of how people tended to settle, what kind of towns they made. And this is an adaptation of the upper half of page 761 from David Hackett Fischer's book. And so we know we've got a big river and all of these little streams or creeks. Do you say cricks, Peggy? Didn't say that.
Nope.
Okay. What'd you call
them? Well.
Whoops, you're muted.
They could have been called creeks or cricks or something like that. Some rivers, and I said anything that you can step over is not a river. You know that. Yeah, I'm sorry, but you can't. But there are maps from this area that will show all of those creeks and hollers like that were produced by J.R. Hildebrand, which are excellent to look at. They're settlement maps.
And in the book, the names of these were individual cabins. And I use that term. They're not plantations. They're not big two-story, clapboard houses like we saw up in New England. These are rustic little cabins. And I did not put the names of individuals because it's not perfectly drawn. And I did not put the names of each one of these little creeks or streams. And they're flowing basically up toward, well, down from the mountain, which would be in the lower left, down through these little bends of the and undulations in the mountains, carved out from centuries of snow melt and everything else. And the water runs up to that Yadkin River point, and people lived here far away from each other. And that's very different from what we've seen before. So let me show you what it looks like. I just took 3 of the 4 patterns. Here's the town square without adequate room for the militia to practice, but we're imagining them here. Typical New England town with the homes all along the main road, the town square. We're not seeing a town square over here with our river people, the backcountry people. We're certainly not seeing a huge plantation home with 3 wings or 2 wings, slave cabins, etc. These folks are living in teeny tiny, I've now zoomed out into space to take this overall view of how these homes could have been arranged. And I think that that's interesting. Let's talk about some of the political and religious strife that they have been experiencing, as you say, Peggy, for literally centuries. Anybody want to dive in on that? Melissa, do you have anybody in this migration group? You have people that ended up in Tennessee, but where were they before?
Well, we talked on another Albion Seed webinar about my French ancestors, the
Yes.
Lee Masters, who came from the Jersey Isles off the coast of France. They came into Maryland. From there, of course, from there they went to Virginia, which became, like Dave said, became West Virginia in 1863. I do have a line of the DeBolts, which are German. They married into the Leemaster family. They came into the Westmoreland, Greene County, Pennsylvania area.
Oh, so kind of back on this other slide like Cousin Russ was talking about. Let me get to this one. So more around this area here.
Yes, yes. They migrated as well down into Virginia and then to the West Virginia area, which became West Virginia, of course.
Right
yeah, none of my family came any more south at that point. And so I'm German, French, and English because I have Bartrams, the famous Bartram brothers. Botanists. I have not connected to them yet, but
we need to talk.
Another cousin, bingo, good.
Yeah, my grandfather was a Bartram, Forrest Cecil Bartram, and so I have the Bartram brothers books that they did on their travels. But so I do have English, but yeah, the Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia area. And then from there, of course, they moved on into Ohio, Miss Peggy. I have very deep roots in Ohio, in the Akron area. So yeah, I don't have Scott Irish.
I know, I always say that incorrectly. I'm glad Miss Peggy corrected me.
But my husband does, and so I research his family as well. And so I have not gotten back as far on his as I have mine.
So for those of us who don't have anyone in any one of these 4 migration patterns, we're still learning how to look at an area and a time period and begin to discover more than just the names and dates for our ancestors, but find more about the history, the context, the traditions, the culture. That's what we're working on. Now, one of the quotes that I took many years ago from this chapter was that they had a violence-shaped culture. That's referring back to needing to defend the honor of your wife, etc. They couldn't defend their land per se if they weren't owning it, but the master thought that he had certain rights, or the landlord. And that's one of the reasons why, it was one of the push factors for why they came here to the colonies. Now, I was looking everywhere for a good real picture of a cabin. And these aren't the glorious, huge log cabins that people put up nowadays with, you know, 2-story high glass windows on one side and a high-pitched roof. They were very primitive. And that dwaddle, or that stuffing that they patched between the wood, was an element that David Hackett Fischer described. So this isn't the, you know, the backcountry people weren't the only people that built log cabins. Certainly the Swedish did. Mr. Myrtle's migration group. Well, actually, it's really the ancestors, because his people came so late. They built wooden cabin type things above where their animals lived. We're not seeing this here. We're seeing down in the lower part of a hill, a cabin built similar to this, very tiny, with chinking or dwaddle, whatever you call it, different people call it different things, between the logs themselves. And the rest of the things, their cattle would be high up on a hill, higher up, if they had it. Did your people have cattle? Do you know, Dave? Do they keep pigs?
I'm sorry, I had to unmute. Yeah, well, in the agricultural census for my 4th great grandfather, he had some cattle, but mostly pigs, I would say. I'm just trying to recollect. I haven't looked at it in a long time, but he had quite a farm. He had 660 acres in
that's pretty
Limestone
unusual.
County. Yeah,
that's
Limestone
way
County.
unusual. So we're talking earlier than that period.
Well, yeah, because that was 18.
That
was in the early 1800s. It was the Veteran War of 1812.
Okay, so we're talking 100, 200 years before that. All right. Now let's take this house style. Well, I want to just add one thing about having the barn and things up high. If you could afford to have a barn. I've got Germans that did this same thing, where then the garden, or the whatever they could scrape up for a kitchen garden, was between the house, and uphill is the barn, where there's manure to fertilize the garden. And wow, that's interesting. We can use gravity to help us distribute that fertilizer. Smart cookies. Nobody said they weren't smart. All right. So when we've looked at our other housing styles, they're markedly different. You can definitely see that lower left, those distressed cavaliers trying to recreate the grand estate with their brick plantations, and I think that's 8 chimneys, combined 4 and 4. So are we getting any comments from the community before we go on?
I just I'll bring one up
okay.
here in a second.
All righty.
That from Sandy, who says there's several examples of these cabins in Boone, North Carolina, at the same park where where they present outdoor theater presentations. They're very small. And Susan says they might be interested in to watch Barnwood Builders on the Do-It-Yourself network on Sunday nights. The crews rescue old log cabins and sell them as new ones.
It is pretty amazing. That's a fun thing. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I love those kinds of things, like where they do let you know more about what the life was like. I went to a place like that in Stockholm, Sweden, and so I know a little bit more about Mr. Myrtle's ancestors. But yeah, I would say that our dear friends who are these folks from the back country areas probably live the most primitively, although with no indoor plumbing, it's all pretty primitive to me. Okay, why I stuck this slide in here, I don't know, but that's just to remind you those 4 migration patterns. All right, let's talk about some of the characteristics. Have you heard of bridal abduction? Oh dear. I just had lightning and my power dipped, but I'm on an uninterrupted power supply and I'm back on again. Did you miss that?
Nope, we're good.
Didn't see anything.
We're getting 70-mile-an-hour gusts and thunder and lightning, and it's been pouring rain all day. Okay, let's hope we don't lose me. All right. To me, this goes along with this kind of vigilantism that they were accustomed to in the old country. You couldn't trust the local sheriff, and then when you're here, you're protecting your own home, your own family, might be extended family close by. But a bridal abduction, don't go to Wikipedia. I did that, and they mostly talk about it in places like India and Pakistan. This was just a typical thing of you kidnap the gal. None of this that we saw with our distressed cavaliers where they married somebody of equal or higher rank so that they could perpetuate this dream of recreating the wealth and the prestige, the social prestige that their parents had enjoyed back in the old country. There were family feuds. I tend to think of these as the ancestors of the Hatfields and the McCoys. Is that a fair assessment, Miss Peggy, would you say?
Well, I'm going to tell you. I can remember years ago in the 1970s that it was either Life magazine or National Geographic had gone to the area of Logan, West Virginia, where the Hatfield and McCoy feud took place, just around the corner from where my family lived. And they showed them having a big banquet and shaking hands over the table, and the feud was officially ended. No. No. When you feud, you are feuding for life because you're always going to make sure that you get them before they get you. And if you really, the Hatfield and McCoy is the most famous, but if you do just a general search on Kentucky feuds, there are hundreds and hundreds of them that they don't end. And there's something else I wanted to mention with the 4 houses that you showed. Now, there's something interesting about that because all of those other 3 homes, those are beautiful. But this little cabin, man, I wish some of my people would have had a cabin that nice.
Wow.
They didn't, and some of them still don't. But these people that came over during the Scots-Irish plantation and when they began to transport their own selves to America here, they had been fighting England and Scotland on the border for years over there. And they had built things that were called Pele houses, which were big things that looked like a mini castle.
Straight up, kind of.
Straight up, and they had stairways on the outside. They were meant to defend yourself. When they got over here, even over there, they started to build what was called a cabin, Cabbin. And that followed them right over here. It meant you may have to leave quickly. And you don't want to leave one of those great big beautiful homes behind you. So what they would do is they would build these houses as good and as firm as they could, knowing that at any point they may be raided by Indians or raided by other people that, were feuding against them or whatever. And that's why you don't find a lot of them that are still standing, because as they continued to move westward into unknown territory, they would take the house apart or they would burn it down. And they would save the nails from it. Because when you go westward into the frontier, you're not going to have a hardware store to go in and buy nails. You're going to take with you what you've already got. That's also where the term dead as a doornail came. Because if you pulled one out and it was crooked like a number 7, you couldn't use that nail. Its strength would be gone, and even if you tried to straighten it out. So that one became dead as a doornail. It was of no use anymore. So, I'm looking at this and I'd love to have that right now, but none of my people had that.
Yeah, I've been to, there's that lightning again. It caused my lights to flicker. so thankful for this uninterrupted power supply. I've been to see some in Tennessee, in the Appalachian area, where there was no chinking like that, no daubing. And the boards were put together, but over time, boards that aren't painted warp, and they shrink from the heat of the sun and all that. So I don't know how I would be freezing to death. I'm a spoiled girl, and I admit that. I recognize that.
I can remember waking up at my grandmother's house, which was a little bit bigger than this, and waking up with snow going in across my bed because there wasn't chinking behind the windows or in between the logs like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I sound like I'm old. I really do, but I just, these are my people.
Yeah. Did you have something that David Hackett Fischer described on page 658 where he said it was a common practice to have two log structures side by side with an open breezeway between them? So would that be because they started with one and then they have more kids, or is that an extended family with another husband and wife? What was that?
That's what my dad built for my mom when they were first married in 1932. It was almost like a breezeway going through there. Mm-hmm. It allowed for animals to be in the middle, like to get out of the elements or any snow or cold or rain. It was just a place that you could find shelter in there. You could bring the animals in. Mm-hmm. With the Germans, their barns were bigger, and they were usually a bank barn. And that's so much in the Appalachian area there.
Yeah.
But that's usually what the middle section was for. That's the exact type of a house that my dad built for my mom.
So that is incredible because here you are, a descendant of these folks still living similarly. And in this scholarly work, he's referring to this kind of a facility, or a home, but he's not describing why, etc. So I really appreciate your putting that in there, because that would also be protecting your animals from, you could corral them in there if you're feuding with the neighbors.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right.
Okay, that was out on a limb for me. Yes, dear.
Those particular houses, like Pat was describing and you're describing, I don't know about anywhere else, but in Tennessee we call them dog trot houses.
Yes, exactly. They refer to that. Yeah.
And my husband's grandfather was born in one. There's a place called the Home Place, which is just over the border from Tennessee. It's in Kentucky, mm-hmm. And it's actually now one of those working farms that when you go there, everyone is dressed in period dress from the 1800s, and they work the farm just like they did back in the 1800s. Mm-hmm. And that dog trot house that he was born in is on that farm.
All right, let's see. This is the home place. Okay, yes. Let me give you this link, Cousin Russ, so you can share it with people.
It's in the Land Between the Lakes area.
Mm-hmm.
And it was explained to us that of course, it could be used for different things, but it was explained that the reason for the breezeway was that they would put the kitchen in one side so that the other side in the summertime could stay cooler.
Mm-hmm.
Or put the fire wherever they would have their fire.
Well, in Florida, they do that in the cracker houses from the early Florida days that the Anglos built, not the Spanish. And they were built. The homes were built out of wood, and they had this central. Well, every room had at least windows on three sides because it's so darn hot. And you had to have air there blowing through, or some kind of a breeze if you ever got one. But the porch area was shade. It wasn't porch, it was that breezeway like you're mentioning, Peggy and Melissa. And the kids would sleep out there in the summer when it was just too hot. But I also have seen where the kitchen was in one part. So it seems to be an interesting theme there, practical use. Your father built the house, Peggy.
He did.
Did it have the chinking or the daubing, or was that something that came later? You don't know?
No,
you were
that
the
was
last kid, weren't you?
I was 50s, but my sisters, it was more of a a clapboard type house. But Melissa's right. There was a kitchen in one end and the rest of the house in the other part, the living quarters or the bedroom and everything. And it's funny, they would put these houses sometimes higher up on a hill to catch that breeze. And this is where a great big strife, the Scots-Irish are at it again in my own family, where my mother's in-laws and all of my dad's siblings, they were all going up the hill to be able to visit my mom and dad, and the wind caught one of the doors and slammed it. Well, they thought my mom was mad and didn't want him to come up, and they didn't speak for like 6 years.
Oh my gosh.
I know. That's the mentality sometimes that you get. Like, well, if she doesn't want us around and she slammed the door, well, they hadn't even gotten up the hill yet.
Yeah, and it was just the wind.
Yeah, it was the wind, because it was up there where it could catch the wind.
So there's also a concept of clans and kith and kin. And it has to do with your family allegiance. And again, we're thinking of the Hatfields and McCoys. And Peggy, your part of your family just wouldn't speak to each other for 6 years because of some perceived slight that was an unintended thing. Your mom probably wondered, well, what happened that they only came halfway up the hill?
I know.
Yeah.
I mean, when they get into an argument, they become right fighters. And again, this is going clear back into some of the nature that would have been in their blood as being right fighters. I'm going to fight, because I'm right and you're not. By the way, I'm a McCoy, for any of you that may be interested.
I hear you.
Yeah, but Devil Anse Hatfield lived right up the road before my mom and dad would have been there. Area.
Yeah, let me show you this from Wikipedia, folks. This is, and of course, these folks, their thing was Civil War and thereafter. But it's like it is in their blood. It's in their genes. It's in their chromosomes. It's in their fight or flight mode that their parents, grandparents, many generations back had lived with. I mean, this was a fight over a pig, and I saw the movie, but I didn't live it. You know what I mean? Yeah.
But you know something, Pat? George Washington made a statement while he was at Valley Forge, and he said, had it not been for that fighting spirit of the Scots-Irish, we would have lost the war. They were good marksmen. They knew how to fight. They knew guerrilla warfare, that had not been practiced at least here in America.
Yeah.
So George Washington had a great admiration for them.
I'm glad that you said that, because when we look at our ancestors, we can't judge them by 21st century, lifestyle or education level or anything like that. It is on the backs of these men who knew the land, knew how to hide behind trees and move on to the next one, as opposed to standing in a line in a red coat and shooting another line of individuals. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that in, because our job is not to judge. Ours is to discern as well as we can what the life experience would have been. You're going to say something. I can just tell, Miss Peggy. Get it out.
But you are exactly right, because they're kith and kin. The reason that a good many of them came here was because they would never have the opportunity to own land living back in Scotland or Ireland. They were fighting for everything that they had come for. So I applaud them for that. It's because sometimes we do place presentism on people from 100 or 200 years ago like that. We shouldn't, but sometimes we do. But it was because of that fierceness of defending your family and everything that you had worked so hard and survived the trip over to even get here.
Now, we should mention that in this chapter, Professor Fischer explains that the women worked just as hard as the men. They were not debutantes being presented at a ball in colonial Virginia. They were there. They could shoot the shotgun. They could tell us about your mother. Wasn't your mother the one that taught you to shoot?
She did. She took me out behind the tobacco barn, and she set up all of these targets. And she taught me how to shoot. She was the best shot in 3 counties. And she would not lose until I had satisfied her that I could do it. She did that every year when we went down there to visit. The other thing that she did is that my mother and her mother, they knew the land. And so my mother would take me out into the woods, and she would have an apron on with maybe some rocks in the pocket. And she had a walking stick with her. And she taught me everything that I could ever survive on if I became lost out there. And so at one point she said to me, now, Peggy, if you're ever lost and you are maybe in a survival mode trying to get out, she says, be very careful of your surroundings, because if you suddenly start to smell cucumber or cantaloupe or something that you shouldn't be smelling, you be very careful. And I said, why? She goes, copperhead. And I said, oh, Mom, come on. So a year or so later, she was out dragging me through the woods again. And I had forgotten really what she had even said about that. At one point, I smelled a cucumber as if somebody had just sliced it and kind of wafted it under my nose. And I turned around and I said, Mom, and she looked at me and she says, no. And she pointed with her finger and said, like, look down. And about, I'm going to say 5 or 6 feet away, there was a copperhead, and it was coiled, and it was ready to strike. And I'm standing there like, I'm a blithering idiot at that point. And I don't know how my mom did this, but she literally reached down in her apron pocket. She had several stones in there. One was kind of triangle shaped and whatever she had. And literally without moving, got her hand down in there, got a rock, and flicked it toward that snake and totally decapitated that snake. I'm like, oh my gosh. I mean, Mother was right again, but I saw her in action. So these things that she was teaching had been what her mother had taught on back for 240 years.
Absolutely. This thing of a mountain grandmother, mountain mother, mama, grandmother, the understanding of the use of herbs for poultices to draw out a snake bite or to take care of some illness or a boil that's from burning yourself when cooking. All of these things got passed down. These women didn't have slaves like we're seeing in Virginia or indentured servants. This is a very different culture, and it's so much. It's so grounded in nature and understanding these ways, as startling as it was to you.
Peggy, is it also true that culture, the stories that you've told, still exist today? At least my experience in southwestern Virginia, because my church would go down and spend a week in Appalachia rebuilding houses, and I remember certain people, family members, come in and do the cooking for the crew, and we would have a crew to 50, 60 kids. But the elder ladies would come in and not only feed us well, but they would tell stories and they would sing the stories as a family at night, especially around a campfire. I just remember those stories just like what you told, but I experienced it with a group of young teenagers who were down helping rebuild some of those houses. Now, the houses that we were rebuilding were not like what you had in the picture, but there was a room that I remember on most houses that we helped rebuild was called a mud room. I never knew what a mud room was until I was down in that part of the country. And so I helped rebuild a mud room one time.
So what is a mud room? Not the breeze, or not the enclosed breezeway between the garage and the main house.
No, but it was the back entrance into the house that had the one that I was on had 3 sides on it. The 4th side was open, but it was called a mud room. So that as you came from the field and went into the house, you went through the mud room to Am I explaining it correctly, Miss Peggy?
Yeah, you are, because they would usually have like one of those little tiny wooden kickstands to help pull your boots off with.
Oh, yeah.
It's where you just kept everything cleaned off of you before you went in the rest of the house. Now, with that, my family that I still have down there today didn't get indoor plumbing for a bathroom until not that long ago. Now, my aunt just died last year, and I remember when she got this bathroom, I've never known anybody in my life to work physically harder than her at setting out tobacco plants and then going back and stripping the tobacco plants and then hanging the tobacco plants. And it's just, I've never known anybody to work harder. But when they first got a toilet put in, she was so excited because now she'd have something to wash her feet off in before she went in the house. And I'm like, I said, no, she says, I'm trying to explain to her. She goes, honey, I got an outhouse for that. I need something to wash my feet off in.
I have a cousin who died in her 90s about 10 or 15 years ago. And her comment she told me that what she used to say when they brought indoor plumbing, she said, when I grew up, we went to the bathroom outside and we cooked inside. Now in this day, we're cooking outside and have the bathroom inside. She couldn't figure it out. Cooking with some barbecues and stuff.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm really enjoying this conversation because we are relating to Peggy and Russ's and each one of our background, what has come down through the generations. I'm glad though that I don't have to walk 1,200 miles between Nauvoo, Illinois and Salt Lake and get stranded in snowdrifts. That would have been one of my migration patterns.
Well, Pat, they also, when they would come over from England or Ireland, these wonderful, fierce women that would have used different things to help to heal and to treat any type of maladies that they may have, they would get over here to America and maybe they wouldn't have those same things growing over here. So they had to relearn what was going to work over here.
Real quick.
And like to save people's lives. And then again, as they traveled onto the Western frontier, the plants that grew back here may not grow out there. So you've got women that are having to learn and start over again.
They're pretty smart.
They are.
That's the second time I've said that in this webinar. Okay. Let's talk about a little bit more about marriage and church and stuff like that. Did you notice in my PowerPoint I didn't have a place for a church? Because that wasn't really part of the layout of their community. In fact, there was a great shortage of ministers. So this is where you start hearing about the thought of a traveling minister. You travel on horseback. He might have a little book, or he might write down that he married somebody. But let's talk about your understanding. Anybody else know about this time period? Did people wait till the traveling minister came through to get married? No, Miss Peggy's shaking her head no.
No, well, not really. It's been said that when the English first settled in a community, the first thing that they built was a church. And when the Germans would come in, the first thing they built was a barn. When the Scots-Irish came in, the first thing they built was a tavern. That's how you distinguish between the three groups. You got a church, you got a barn, you got a tavern. So they're not going to usually have that. Now, what they would do is, as they were sometimes back in the hills and the hollers, without any type of a church coming into fruition there, then sometimes what they would do, if a couple wanted to get married and there is no justice of the peace and there is no minister and there's no circuit rider that they know that is going to be coming through anytime soon, then they may have the person that was maybe the most respected in the community, like Squire Boone was in Boonesboro. And he might come and say a few words over the couple, and that would do until somebody who could really make it legal came along.
Yeah,
well, can I mention that in Plymouth Colony, they didn't have a church. The first thing they built was not a church. It was just called a meeting house. And they didn't have a minister because their minister from Leiden, Reverend Robinson, didn't come over from Leiden with them. And he never came over, as a matter of fact.
Declined to come,
right.
Didn't he?
So, yeah, he declined to come. He stayed with the congregation in Leiden. And Peggy's right. But it was a well-respected member of the community. They would name him a deacon. One of my eighth great grandfathers here in Springfield was a deacon, and they would perform the marriages until they managed to get a minister. But I was shocked when I went to Plymouth, the Plymouth Plantation, and no churches, just the meeting house, on top of the hill. By the way, it was above everything. It was just a meeting house.
Yeah, and remember that concept of bride abduction. Let's go kidnap her. And it had to do with this kind of, I guess the Jewish would say they had chutzpah. These men they were just, this group held Highland game type things. It was a lot of competition. It was a matter of men were in power. They were in charge of their family, their property, etc., and they were going to defend it. Interesting.
There were a lot of cases of unmarried women somehow becoming pregnant, and they would be brought before the court. I'm talking Plymouth Colony, 1620, 25, 30, brought before the court, and unless they got married, they would be punished or threatened with being, put in the
stocks or the pillory.
The stocks or the pillory, right? And so those folks got married, but again, it was a deacon of the community that would marry him off. Now, very shortly after that, now these are Puritans I'm talking about. I'm not talking about any other religious sect that emigrated during the Great Migration. They're strictly the Puritans.
So we're contrasting that with what we're finding out about this migration group to the backwoods. Let me read this from page 760 of David Hackett Fischer's book. This is a report of a German traveler in 1784, and he observed this in the backwoods farms of North Carolina. Quote, they were scattered about in these woods at various distances, 3 to 6 miles, often as much as 10 or 15 or 20 miles apart. I guess you didn't want to get too close to people, huh? It's a little different than let's put our house in the middle of our humongous plantation of 2,000 acres.
Well, Pat, if they saw the smoke rising from a neighbor, that was too close for them.
Way too close.
Yeah, we got to get away from here. It's getting too crowded. Now, also with this other thing you mentioned with kidnapping the woman, my parents only went to 6th grade, and they were not highly educated, but they both kept journals. And I was reading about my mother's wedding day, and I'm trying to read it in hillbilly, because that's how I have to read it to understand it. And she said that they put, my maiden name is Clemens, and she called my dad that. They put Clemens on a pole and took him to the middle of town, and then he fell off the pole, and they couldn't get him up, and he couldn't get up, and that was our wedding day. They all came and serenaded us at night, and we bought pillows and candy for everybody. No, they bought Mom and Dad pillows and candy to them. I thought, what is this about? I mean, they put my dad on a pole. My dad looked like Colonel Sanders. He was a little short man. And I'm like, what are they doing to my dad? Until I looked up the chivalry. And that's exactly a thing straight from Scotland that continued on through the 200 and some years my family's been there. It was still going on in 1932.
Yeah, so we're not talking a big fancy wedding with all the bridesmaids and everything else. That would have been our Virginia Cavaliers trying to emulate such wealth as in the King's Court. Yeah. What about revenuers? What about stills? Can you imagine in this area, folks? And I still have this picture of the Hatfield clan from 1897. Those women look fierce. Kids look pretty cute, and I like that dog. But if that's your source of income, you're going to defend that to the hilt and keep it hidden away and shoot the neighbor if he tells, that kind of a thing. I can imagine that happening. This is not the kind of, these aren't, it isn't so much that they're not law-abiding. There was no law and order. There was no government. There was no structure for a county sheriff or the local police or anything like that. It wasn't highly structured and enforced like Dave was talking about up in New England. It was enforced by individual family groups because there was no, they were in the borderlands. There was no government structure. There was no ecclesiastical structure that covered that area in the time period. So it's really quite a distinctive way to live. And I think it was a rough way to live, but it's what they were familiar with back in the old country. Now, I know our time is up, actually, but I'd like to say this. Whether we're talking the Hatfield and McCoy ancestors, any one of these 4 migration groups, the whole point of Dr. Fischer's book was to compare and contrast 4 groups and to have us see what were the traditions in the old country and how they carried over into the new country. I think he did it very well. People have criticized him. There's always critics, aren't there? Cousin Russ is giving you the link to David Hackett Fischer having been given a Pulitzer Prize for some of the historical analyses that he's done. And it certainly behooves us to consider these very same things when trying to discover the culture that was prevalent, the societal pressures, the attitudes toward raising children, the role of women in that community, the role of men in that community. Yeah, I think that some of those women would have run circles around me. I'm definitely a city girl. But I have a great deal of respect for people who can read the seasons, can read the land, know when to plant. These old ways cannot be lost from us, and they cannot be replaced by I'm getting political here, by all kinds of chemical fertilizers and things along that line. Poor Richard's Almanac and those old ways are the best ways. In the 70s, I wasn't smoking pot and LSD, but I was making bread from scratch. And I did have a health food store where I understood from old ladies in that community in Long Island, very elderly, 90-year-old, could still be as spry as a young chicken, except that their faces were leathery from the sun and had lots of wrinkles. And they could tell you a thing or two. And if you listened with an open heart, it's amazing what you could learn. So I hope that you have enjoyed our 4-part series. Now what I'm going to do, y'all know I've been getting over this horrible flu. And I almost didn't make it tonight, but I love this chapter because of the earthiness and the authenticity of the people in this migration group. I'm not denigrating the others, and maybe I am being judgmental about it, but I like regular people where you know which end is up and they're not playing a game. I will do this. Cousin Russ, where's our... Okay, let me get to the right thing. Here's where our conversation will continue. Over on my blog, I will create a blog post, embed this video with your comments and all the links that we mentioned. And at the bottom of that blog post, as well as the other 3 blog posts, I will be sure to have a link so that if you come into Dear Myrtle's blog, you will, and find one of these, you'll be able to find the other 3 of these migration groups. It's been a fascinating thing to look at this book. I don't know. Anything desperate we need to talk about from the community, Russ? This is different for me to mostly talk just with the panelists or lecture.
I just posted a link to where the chat will continue.
Thank you so much. And you've had a long day too, because you taught a class in between all of this. So I don't know. You'd think we get tired of talking about our favorite subject, genealogy. Well, the only time I get tired is if the little redhead girl comes over. Then all bets are off on playing with the kid. I don't know. All right, folks. Thank you for hanging out with us tonight. Nothing left to say, but thank you to Miss Peggy for being here, for her insights. Thank you to David, and also to Melissa and Cousin Russ. I sure appreciate you, and I'm glad to be working with you on all these endeavors. I'm Dear Myrtle, your friend in genealogy. Happy family tree climbing, everybody. That's a wrap.